history, when I think of what do words mean, I have to go to the 7th century theologian Isidore of Seville. He wrote a famous work called the Etymologies, which are famously not always accurate etymologies, often looking at how words are possible meanings behind them, but linguistics have shown that they're not always where that word came from. When you look at presence, which is the word for presence, he says it's that which is put before the senses. And in particular, that praesens or praesentibus is that which is put before the eyes. Because he says the eyes are that which are the senses of the body. A neat thing with presence, though, is that it includes things that are beyond our senses of the body, and it definitely beyond the senses of our eyes. When we think about presence, it can include ghosts, it can include hauntings, it can include souls. It can also include someone having a commanding presence. And so presence can also include the ineffable qualities of presence, the things that are both seen and unseen. But the eyes are also deceiving, as much as Isidore says we should use them in understanding presence. And so too, humanity from early on, arguably earlier than Thomas plunging his hand into Jesus' side, to prove that our eyes can be deceiving, and that to understand presence, sometimes we have to go to that touching. We have to use our other senses. And so in the field of history, I find when thinking about presence, I think about a connected definition that is applicable, this notion that it's something that is noticed. It's something that is just noticed. And I think what gets seen or noticed in historical narratives is gravely important and currently hotly contested. Whose stories are present and how they're presented tell us about who we are and what we value now. Now, exactly who gets noticed in historical narratives has thankfully evolved over time. It has changed our understanding also of why we say certain things happen the way they did. We've gone away from just caring about what those in charge or monarchs or elites did to caring about, what the rest of society did. And those in my history class, we've talked about the idea of the great man theory, these notions that individual men had shaped great movements, and that most things in history, most turning points, were explained with this idea of a great man theory, among others. Thankfully, now we complicate that. We complicate it with looking at economics, looking at war, but also looking at gender, looking at social history, looking at political history, and setting people aside and looking at environmental history. What can the land tell us about what has happened over time? And how can it explain why things happen or did not happen in the past? I believe there's still room for improvement in how we include or notice history. So I want to chat today about a couple different ways we can see the presence of women in history. And I'm going to start with an example that can show us that sometimes the presence for women are in fact small, literally. And the first example I want to share is actually the one I know the least amount, but I've had the most time with. And this is in fact a purse that was given to me by my grandmother that was found of an estate sale. After purchasing a china cabinet in California, it was in the drawer, and so she gave it to me. When you open the purse, you'll note that there's a note inside saying that Papa gave this to Lena, October 2nd, 1865, her 9th birthday. And so we have this presence of Lena, this young girl, receiving this purse while the Civil War is still gonna be ending, but still ongoing. And we can try to extrapolate a little bit about her by knowing what she lived through, but we're kind of left without knowing a whole lot more about Lena's individual presence in history. We then would have to look and try to figure out things like where that china cabinet actually come from. Was it in the original owner's hands? What was Lena's surname? Can we track down who this family was? Did they get to California as part of other travelers going out west, or was this something that just switched hands over time? Looking at the presence of this We could also ask questions about the presence of who made the object. Looking through catalogs and online auctions last night, I came to find that it showed a lot of similarities with Iroquois beaded bags that were made in the 1860s. These were made and sold to tourists in Niagara Falls. And so if you note the image there of the little girl with that beaded bag, and the similarity it shows with the other ones I found in auction houses. And then we can track down even further those who have written about this cherished curiosity, this book that looks at the whole making of these Iroquois bags and how they were sold. This example is one that can show us that one object can actually have multiple presences. Some more obscure than others, but nevertheless, we can look together to see multiple presences in any one historical item. Now, such small additions like this note, I really am fascinated with. And when I come across them in my own research on medieval history, I'm drawn to them. I have to stop and pause because someone took the action of writing something down. Now, also in objects like this, we have to consider the absences, right? And in that, we can see what was assumed to be known by the audience. Whoever wrote this assumed that whoever read it would of course know who Papa and Lena are. They might forget the date that this was given. They might forget that it was on the occasion of her 9th birthday. But they knew whoever would read it would know who these people are. And so in that absence, we can also understand the assumed audience of even this little scrap of evidence. Who it was meant for, who would have read it. Now, like I said, in small objects like this, I've always been fascinated when I've come across it in my own research. And so I want to turn to some examples from medieval history to look at the presence of other women. I came across this obit written and added into the front of a collection of medieval sermons. In it, you'll see it's almost like a form that has been filled in to personalize the details of the person who died. It is in French, and I have the rough translation there for you, that in the morning of 16 November, today, in the monastery of Marenthal near Luxembourg of the Dominican order, Cécile Nani, the organist, patiently suffered sickness for 10 days. She died at the age of 21. She was professed, meaning having joined the convent, at the age 2. So we can see in this that there's also this understanding of another presence of Cécile, that she existed at this time and her experiences as recorded in this. But they also interacted with this form, which I find unique, and you really can't see it from where you are, but they crossed out where in the form it uses the adjective noble, as just kind of a noble and cherished sister died, fill in the blank on when. And they crossed noble out and added that she was the organist. They wanted that to be included. But like our previous example, we don't necessarily get to know a whole lot more about her. And I'm left with more questions. Questions like, why include an obit at the beginning of this collection of sermons? When was that kind of shuffled in there and added? What did the person think other people would think when they saw it? Would they pause? Would they remember her? Would they know who Cécile was? So again, the presence can be one that also obscures. But when I saw this, I also recalled that I had seen another type of presence like this. And in fact, in an older text, a 13th century text that's small, it's about the size of your hand, someone had sewn in an even smaller little handwritten obit. I translated there that it says, "We offer our prayers for Sister Anna who professed as a nun and died in Houston. Let us remember her and all the faithful who have departed in the Lord." This little obit is written and sewn into a story, a life of a holy woman, Marie Dornier. And so they've included it within this. And an interesting thing with devotional literature is it was seen as not just an act of reading. It was a religious act of devotion too. And so it's interesting to think about them sewing in this life of her and wanting her to be part of that act of devotion, that you would pause in reading about this holy woman to lift up prayers for Anna. But again, we're left not with all the information we want to know about Anna, even less than Cecile. How long did she live? What job did she have in her community? Did she profess at a young age, or did she enter the monastery at an older age? We don't know. But an interesting thing with both of these sources is there's an unnamed presence that these sources reflect, and that's the people who paused and took the moment to commemorate the lives of these women. In fact, in many ways, it's their presence we more directly see in these sources than the women they're talking about. Obits, I find a fascinating relationship to presence, that they are in a way a final proclamation of existence, that someone was present in this life. Now, in the case of Anna, the obit is recorded in this other life of miracles of the woman Marie. And she offers another example of how we have this common challenge in trying to uncover the presence of women in history. And that's often we have the evidence for them has been filtered through the writings of others, often men. And so how do we get at their presence if what we're seeing is actually not shaped by them themselves? Now, in the case of Marie Doigny, she did gain a following in her lifetime for her pious life and miracles. She became known to bishops and popes. We do have objects of her. Not only do we have this life account written by her friend and confidant, Jacques de Vitry, but we also have her sarcophagus. We also have pieces of her body that were made into relics and put into reliquaries. And so we have all this evidence about her, but the words that tell us about her life are not words she chose. They're words that were chosen by someone else. And while a friend and someone who knew her in her lifetime, when reading the account of her life, we then have to look at what were the things he was hoping to accomplish, what were the things that he wanted to do in writing this. And so this kind of two-step removed happens from the past. And the thing is this is not unusual. It's very seldom that we have autobiographical accounts written by everyone we want to talk about in the past. We have to navigate those absences of that individual agency to then reconstruct that presence in the past. Now, like I said, Marie's not unusual. And most of her sources were not, as other sources are not, direct witnesses. And so we're constantly gravitating between those absences and presence. And you might think, okay, that's the case, right? Fragmentary evidence, put in the margins, indirect evidence, this is what we have to reconstruct the experience and role of medieval women. But the area I find the most peculiar is when there's ample and clear evidence, not only of women's presence, but their agency and influence, and yet there's a glaring absence from the historical narrative. In those cases, I have to step back and ask why. What were the choices of the author? What were the choices of the editors? Now, the type of selective process that happens on including or excluding certain narratives in history, I find the most opaque in the type of sources you've probably encountered history the most, and that's the textbook. Textbooks, love them or hate them, do some heavy lifting. They distill down a synthesis of generations of scholarship into ordered chapters with themes and keywords. They index them, making them searchable, and they have to select things. To make their thematic connections and points, they have to pick certain details. And for every detail that is included, there were many that were excluded. And so the presence of certain stories in history necessitates the absence of others. But what is left out certainly can transform the meaning. And I want to share with you one such example from medieval history that's been on my mind lately. Now, textbooks about medieval Europe or about church history, and sometimes included in Western civilization textbooks, will include an account of an 11th century event that will be labeled as the investiture controversy. It is presented in these type of works. It's a complicated event, so they do have to distill it down. But it's presented as a debate between Pope Gregory VII and the German king Henry IV. They are debating over lay investiture, meaning the right to appoint bishops, and who should have that right. In these textbooks, the drama unfolds with the Pope excommunicating the king saying you're not the real Pope, and it culminates into this moment on a wintry day in Canossa, where the king begs barefoot in the snow, and here's our Henry and Gregory, but where the king begs barefoot in the snow for forgiveness by the Pope, and so he grants it. But this moment then flashes forward to another Henry, in Henry V, and talks about that this conflict is somehow resolved at an interesting agreement called the Concordat of Worms, where they agree that they kind of will separate the investment among the ecclesiastical, the church kind of spiritual authority, and the bishop's secular or earthly authority. And so we're kind of left with this gap between those two in getting to that resolution. Now, in this account, it is used often to talk about the rising of papal power. It's often to talk about church reform, things like the Gregorian form, named after Gregory himself, which here I'll give you that scene with Henry at the door on that snowy day. It is used often to talk about this separation or arm wrestle between the secular authorities and popes that were ongoing in the Latin West over time. Often next, the textbook then proceeds to another history, a history of the Holy War, with another Pope, Pope Urban II, an also champion of these kind of reforms. And it begins with him calling people to rescue their brothers in the East from Muslim enemies, to take Jerusalem for spiritual rewards. This event will later be called and counted as the First Crusade. In this drama of this leading two men battling it out, sometimes textbooks will mention the presence of a woman. And so, like this textbook does, it says, they met in a refuge provided by the staunchest of papal supporters, Countess Matilda of Tuscany. That is her only mention. And so Matilda's presence mysteriously enters, then exits the historical narrative. Her presence noticed, but vaguely, and perhaps even more confusing by only mentioning her there. She is somewhat kind of a hostess or a cheerleader, championing Gregory, the Pope's side. But unlike our sister Anna, unlike Cecile, unlike Marie Dogny, we have an abundance of evidence. We have chronicles, poetry, we have hagiographical accounts, these spiritual biographies. We have sources written by those close to her. We have sources written by people who liked her and hated her, which is good for a historian. You want to see both sides. We have sources even of the churches that she had built under her reign. But we also have letters to and from her directly. And I know it's small print there, but that's a listing and it's multiple pages of the letters to and from her. These have been made available in readily English translations and posted online for all to see. Unfortunately, we don't have her letters that were written to the Pope, but we do have letters that she wrote to other people and letters she received from the Pope too. And so with all this evidence, we then have to ask, why is she left out of the textbooks? We also even have this illustrated vita, this life of hers, that has actually been reproduced by the Vatican. 2,000 copies for prices, it says subject to negotiation online. So we have multiple examples of where we can draw information about Matilda. And so her presence, though, isn't absent from another area. Her presence is available to be seen in academic conversations, in other texts. And this is just examples of the English texts that have been written about Matilda's life. So academics have been publishing books on her, writing articles on her, writing their dissertations to get their PhDs on Matilda. From those sources, you can learn the following, that Matilda and her mother Beatrice ruled Tuscany together after her father had died. You learn that after her husband Godfrey died and after her mom died, she would go to rule in her own right, not as regent, but having no heirs and no other male heirs, Matilda would rule. She would rule Tuscany and Lorraine, and her domain would increase in her lifetime. Now, that staunch support of the Pope, what did that look like? Well, it was both financial and militarily. She ran her troops. She was the general. And so when we think about the events that came to play in the investiture itself, we have to look at the fact that it's actually Matilda. She's the whole reason the Pope ends up in this area in Canossa. She invites him to leave Rome and to come to her castle. Under her command, she offers protection. When the men won't come to an agreement, reports note that Matilda steps in and intervenes. Moreover, that huge weird gap between that moment in the snow, and the conclusion in another kind of generation, things get a little complicated. Gregory himself ends up defeated. He dies in exile. Henry sets up his own anti-pope, and so Matilda marches her troops successfully on Rome. And when Henry tries to take and attack Canossa, she again successfully defeats him. She encouraged Henry's next wife, Adelaide, and their son to defect, and they did. She provided them protection. And then also, as the textbooks moved from investiture contest to holy war, Matilda also had a role in both realms. In fact, after the Byzantine forces lost at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, that Pope Gregory VII would write a general letter to all the princes, but also a personal letter to Matilda, urging her to help financially, to send an expedition, and to go herself, to go east. Now, she didn't end up personally going herself. She would send troops to an expedition that would happen in the Muslim city in North Africa. It would be some of her own bishops and her own counselors that would write our first justification of sacred war. Now, she did also help usher French troops that responded to the call to the First Crusade to make their way from Tuscany through Rome. But she didn't go herself. Again, not an obscure source, readily translated, available in a reader on medieval warfare. So again, we have to ask, with all of this information, where we do have sources that aren't translated, we have sources that haven't even been looked at. But with Matilda, that's just not the case. She seems to be everywhere. But why isn't she in that textbook or others like it? Why isn't she part of this conversation? Now, I hope even with this brief explanation of Matilda's accomplishments, it shows just how impressive she was. But I would have to say, as an aside, when we're talking about the presence of medieval women, we have to be careful. We can't go making a Netflix series about, boss lady Matilda who ruled Tuscany. Because in fact, she wasn't a champion for some sort of, women's rights. In fact, she was a champion for church rights. And so we have to constantly kind of navigate when we talk about presence, that we don't impose anachronistic presence onto the past as well. But coming back to that textbook, why is she mostly absent, and what can we actually do to correct it? Now, many textbooks have gone a long way in encouraging a balance of perspectives, a balance of men and women, rich and poor, written sources, and other documentary evidence. One solution that I grew up with that I actually found really still remains, because I found all these this morning, is the highlighted box of doom, as I will call it. It is the box that sets apart interesting folks, some stories. Sometimes they're used in great ways to highlight primary sources or ongoing debates. But it's also, at least in my generation, where women's history got added on. Instead of changing that main narrative, you put a little bit of an anecdote about a woman in the past, and you put them in that box. It often sets them apart. It sets them apart as special, but it also sets them apart as perhaps an oddity, as exceptional, not part of the main narrative. Sometimes it's also used even just decoratively, and often they'll also pull examples that truly are exceptional or are extremes, the sinner or the saint. But adding Matilda to a highlighted box wouldn't really cut it, given how integral she was to the main stage. But including her involvement would complicate a lot of things. The book editors and the authors would really have to readdress more than just adding in Matilda's presence. It would require a wholesale revision of the investiture contest. It would overturn any simple binary of popes versus kings. To set up her role, you need to step a little bit further back and probably talk about abbesses, probably talk about empresses and queens, to set up the precedent of women's authority as both contrast and some similarities with what Matilda does. You would then probably have to step back and also include people like Henry's wife Bertha, who was there, but is not in the description there. But then you'd have to also include his next wife, Adelaide, that actually ran to Matilda for support. Such revisions would have to highlight that the investiture contest was more than a verbal slinging of accusations. It was more than an excommunication and a deposition, but it was the investiture wars. But then you'd actually have to talk about that war involved women, in fact, in leadership positions. And if you're going to do that, then you probably have to talk about Matilda's involvement with Holy War, because she arguably serves as a much better hinge to move in that conversation from church reforms to Holy War. But arguably, if you do that, then you might actually have to consider and include the fact that women were part of the rest of the Crusades. And so you would have to go and revise and look at the crusading movement in general and integrate women's involvement in crusading activities, their diverse roles in the home front and in the Crusader states themselves. Given how much work this would take, perhaps that's why she remains in these books, if she remains at all. Often she's not included, as just the staunch supporter of the Pope. So what's at stake with her exclusion? What's at stake with any type of absence in the past? One I find is that students will often have an assumption about medieval women. They have an assumption that is usually some sort of combination of complete oppression and a lack of any agency. And this is not, in fact, the truth. The examples that I've tried to show students are often still seen as exceptions. This is an exception. This was not the norm. But works like this book I have posted there, where the editor, Heather Tanner, notes in the introduction that acceptance of the quotidian nature of elite women's power is arguably the last hurdle to clear for those seeking to understand not only medieval elite women, but also the operation of medieval power structures as a whole. And I don't think you could do that with a highlighted box. I don't think we can include Matilda in a casual anecdote, but she has to be included firmly in the center of action, where the evidence reveals that she was in fact present. And the neat thing about presence, whether it's a small little obit, or whether it is in a whole book, or whether it's in a whole event, is that once you see it, once you actually notice it, you can't really go back and unsee it. It changes the way you see that history, which then can change the way we see our own presence. And I thank you for yours today. So that's it.